Hello again, my name's Dee Campbell and welcome to another one of my medical coding, billing, and documentation videos. Today we're going to be talking about excluded diagnoses. It's a very fun concept about conditions that can or cannot be together that I've taught so many providers about and so many different coders about. I'm not shocked that providers aren't aware of these because most providers I talk to have maybe a single lecture about medical coding in all of their schooling. So, not shocked about that one. Coders, yeah, you probably should know about some of these. But there's quite a few more out there that you may not be aware of. So in this video, we're going to be talking through, I got about 30 of the most common ones and the ones with the biggest amount of excluded diagnoses for it. So, if you're not certain what excluded diagnoses are, here is the definition for them. There are two different kinds of excluded diagnoses. We have a excluded 1 and an excluded 2 here. We're not even going to talk about 2 today because there's just so many of 2s and it's not as important of a concept. Instead, we're going to be addressing excluded 1s. Excluded 1s are conditions that cannot be coded together. They should never ever be used together. This is what it explicitly says. A type 1 excluded note is pure exclude notes. It means not coded here. An excluded 1 note indicates that the code excluded should never be used at the same time as the code above the excluded 1 note. An excluded 1 is used when two conditions cannot occur together, such as a congenial form versus an acquired form of the same condition. That's pretty obvious. You can't have an acquired form with a congenial form, but there's a lot of other ones out there that aren't as obvious to people that you can't have. You can find a full list of them here. I would recommend reviewing it at some point, but otherwise, let's just strap in and look at these together. We're going to start out with a couple very common ones that are more easy to break down the concept and how it works, and then we're just going to go down through all the chapters. We're just going to do alphabetical order for the most common ones in each different organ system section of it, except we're saving mental health codes all for the very end of the video. So if you only do mental health coding, feel free to jump to the very end of the video. I'll have at the bottom here when your section starts. So let's strap in. I am a medical coder, so I strictly read charts. I don't really speak it often. So have fun listening to me say a bunch of things wrong, more than likely. So if I say something wrong, please drop it in the comments, the phonetic way of saying it or something like that. I'd appreciate it. So let's start out with other fatigue. Other fatigue is a very common one that you'll see a lot of denials with because it's a very common code. It happens all the flipping time that people are coming in for it. One of the main ones that I wanted to point out to start out with this concept for excluded 1s is, as you can see here, it excludes the depression code F33. For reoccurring depression, any F33 code is going to deny it because obviously fatigue is an included symptom in depression. But it's also very common that I'll see providers want to order a fatigue panel just to figure out if there's another reason for why it's happening. Maybe you want to order CMP or something like that. You want to order labs to just make sure there's not another reason going on for said fatigue. In that case, there's going to be a denial because this patient has a depression code and then also a fatigue code on their charts. So what's important is you as the provider have to document what you're trying to do with your labs, so that way coding... Oh, my camera's getting wonky, one sec. So that way your coding team can know whether or not they should assign the depression codes to it, or if they should assign the fatigue code to it or not. So that's how these work. Insurance is always looking for a reason to deny. Don't give them a reason to deny. But if you have this R53.83, other fatigue, with any of these codes here, you are going to end up with a denial. I will say the depression one is the most common one. Other one are heat exposures and different exposure issues. Not really as common of an issue that you'll see. Next one is this code here, Encounter for Supervision of Normal Pregnancy, Z34. Great way to start with the concept of excluded 1 diagnoses and how they end up working. So a normal pregnancy code, as you can see, excludes every single O code underneath the entire window because O codes are considered complications of pregnancy codes. So obviously, if your patient has any sort of complication with their pregnancy, it is not a normal pregnancy. So you can never have this normal pregnancy code with any O code. If you have them together, insurance is going to be able to deny you. And then you see this one here, kind of goofy. Encounter for pregnancy test is an excluded code. So I know you're thinking, well, D, what about confirmation pregnancy visits? How am I supposed to handle that? Quite interesting, and a good way to think about this is when we split the labs off. So the patient will end up having either an O or a Z34 pregnancy code on just their office visits, and then the 81025, that's the pregnancy test code, that will only have a Z32 code on it, saying that the patient is pregnant. So that's how excluded diagnoses work and how they have to be split off. So that's what we're looking at here. Next one that's a kind of common concept, that we're going to look at diabetes here. Not a kind of concept, very common concept. Diabetes codes, as you can see, are actually pretty easy for exclusions. For the most part, diabetes, as you can see, excludes other diabetes codes, because obviously they would. You can't have type 1 diabetes with a type 2 code. You can't have drug-induced diabetes with them. It's one or the other. So that's how these exclusions work. It also excludes gestational diabetes. Any other diabetes code is going to be excluded by it. So that's how these concepts work. It's actually pretty easy when you think about it from this simpler way first. Just starting out with diabetes, obviously you can't have more than one type at a time. Fatigue is going to be included in depression, so you can kind of think about it that way. And then another easy one is pregnancies aren't normal if there's any complication. So now let's get into the more weeds of it. Now we're going to be more just going in alphabetical order here for different conditions and using the most common ones in each different chapter here. The E section is our endocrine and nutritional codes here. There's quite a few denials for the E70 through E88 section. This is the metabolic disorder section. All of these codes are going to exclude all of these conditions here. So it's one or the other. You can either have these conditions on the patient's record, or you can have a metabolic disorder condition on their record. Make certain it's one or the other. You can never have both. And then there's a couple carve-outs here where mixed hyperlipidemia and disorders of calcium metabolism, they each have their own additional carve-outs for excludeds. So it's always important to look at the whole chapter summary, because it might seem like hyperlipidemia only has 2 exclusions when you look at the book. But actually, if you look all the way back to the guidelines, it has all 5 of these as well. So just make certain you're aware of these when it comes to it. I don't know how common a lot of these conditions are. Some of these I've honestly have never seen, and I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce. And other ones are actually very common, like hyperparathyroidism. You see that all the flipping time, or I'm going to say this one absolutely wrong probably, but you do see it often, chondrocalcinosis. I know that would be stones. So I can't really say the words, but I do know them. So let's move on to the asthma and COPD section here. COPD I have on the left side here. Asthma codes I have on the right side here. Asthma isn't as bad for exclusions as it is compared to COPD, but obviously what it is a lot of the R codes and stuff and common conditions you can't have together. So you can't have wheezing with asthma because of course they're going to wheeze. And then more specific asthma codes can't be with the more, not to say generic, ooh, that camera got real wonky. One sec. Apologies, I don't know why my camera came with such a short cord. It just gets too much tension and it starts pulling on itself. Anyways, COPD and asthma. The main ones that you have to watch out for COPD especially is not as much the exclusions here, but includes are also a category to consider here, where you also have them included in each other. So just watch out for that. With COPD, you can also code the type of asthma when applicable. because obviously in a lot of cases an asthmatic will progress into COPD, so you can keep both together. They're not actually excluding each other. It's more COPD is going to exclude bronchitis and stuff like that. That's going to be obviously included. Pneumonia is kind of a hard one. I actually have this broken down into 3 separate slides here. So strap in, because pneumonia has a lot of exclusions and a lot of very strict reporting guidelines. So pneumonia and disease classified elsewhere are the J17 codes. These ones require you to first code the underlying condition that caused the J17. These are the applicable diseases for it that you can attach to it, or you can attach more depending on your documentation. These are just the most common ones that the ICD-10 book links. And then it excludes all of these conditions. It really isn't as bad as what it looks, because as you can see, most of them are just other pneumonias. Just more or less, it's just you have to report the most specific pneumonia code, and you can't report chlamydia pneumonia with this pneumonia. So just make certain you're reporting the most specific pneumonia code possible. So this is actually just a really good list too of all the different pneumonia specific codes. So if you're having a hard time figuring out different ones, it might be easier just to look at the generic code and then look at the excluded list. Sometimes that's what I do when I'm trying to find a code. Well, we have viral, strep, and bacterial. Other pneumonias have these guidelines here, where they have all the code first, where you have to code first the associated condition that caused said pneumonia, and then it has all these different excluded here's to watch out for. So just make certain you're reporting the most specific pneumonia code possible. As you can see, it's almost all pneumonia codes. So you can see this section gets really specific, where the viral pneumonias and such are broken down for specific ones even further. So we have a viral pneumonia code, we have a pneumonia due to strep code, we have pneumonia due to Haemophilus influenza, we have bacterial pneumonia not elsewhere classified, and finally pneumonia due to other infectious organisms. So you can see every single one of them have their code first, where you obviously have to code the specific condition that is causing said pneumonia. Make certain to list it on the chart first, obviously, and then the pneumonia code secondary. And yeah, just make certain you're following these guidelines here and you're not combining any of them together. And you're using the most specific pneumonia code. And I got one more pneumonia code. Pneumonia unspecified organism. This is probably the most commonly used code by providers, because providers like unspecified codes. Let me move myself here. J18. This code, unspecified organism, has the most excludeds out of all of them, because it wants you to make certain that you're using this one appropriate. So just make certain you're not using it with any other pneumonia code or any other pneumonia code that's caused by anesthesia, that kind of stuff here. Just make certain you're using this one appropriately. So code first if applicable, an associated influenza as well. And that's pneumonia guidelines. So just make certain you're reporting them right. Just basically what it boils down to is they all just want you to use the most specific pneumonia code when possible, when you know which organism's causing it. If you don't know what's causing it, then you can use these codes, but just make certain you're not including it with like anesthesia causing it or something else causing the pneumonia. And that's about it. Pneumonia is actually a little easier than what it seems to be. It's just a lot of codes in a pretty big section. Oh, I got another pneumonia. Sorry, I lied. 4 pneumonias. I then have the viral and bacterial pneumonia codes. Here I just have it listed out of all the different ones here that you can use for it. So if SARS caused the pneumonia or coronavirus, whatever caused the chlamydia, all these different codes are the most specific viral codes you can use. Viral has a lot of different codes. Pneumonia strep only has the one. Haemophilus influenza only has the one. And then bacterial is broken down into these, 10 different codes. Really not that hard. Next, we're going to be moving on to other deformities. Other deformities of the dorsopathies, these end up having some exclusions as well, because obviously they're in here. This whole section here is the M43 chapter. So, I mean, not chapter, section of codes. M43 codes, as you can see, has its own excluded list in itself. And once again, this is going to be like how the hyperlipidemia one works, where a lot of people get mistaken. They're like, oh, spondylosis only has 2 different codes that can't go with it. No, that's actually incorrect, because you have to look back to M43 in its entirety, because it also excludes all of these different codes here. More or less what a lot of them are just like congenial conditions or stuff like that that are obviously going to cause some different conditions, different issues and stuff like that. So fusion of spine and stuff like that is going to be obviously go against congenial fusion of spine and that kind of stuff. So just be careful with these codes, make sure you're reporting them properly. And that's about it with this one. Honestly, kind of a boring subject. I really don't want to sit here just reading off all the different conditions every single time. You can kind of see it. This is just more or less to let you know that all these exclusions exist for different conditions. M63, disorders of muscles and disease classified elsewhere. M63 has this code first guideline here that you have to first code the underlying disease that ended up causing the condition that made it so they have a disorder with their muscles. And then it also excludes all of these different codes here. Just all the myopathy codes from different conditions, and you can't have it with it. Oh, wrong direction. Pathological fractures. Pathological fractures have 2 different sets of codes here. First, it has the codes for neoplastic disease causing it, so make certain to code first the underlying neoplasm every single time. Let me move my blob here. Pathological fracture and other disease, that when you also have to code the secondary underlying condition that caused it, so just make certain you're aware of that. And then they also have pathological fracture not elsewhere classified. These ones obviously exclude each other because these are more strict codes. I mean, no, not more strict, more specific codes. And then it'll also exclude traumatic fractures, stress fractures, and other fracture codes. So just watch out for these kind of codes. Make certain you're using the most specific pathological fracture codes when possible. Make certain you're coding the underlying neoplasm when applicable, or letting your coding team or the documentation tell which condition is causing the pathological fracture. M90, osteopathist and diseases classified elsewhere. I am just butchering words today. I guess that's what happens when my confidence is low. But hey, I'm having fun, and it's a good way to learn some more. Excluded ones, each of these codes exclude all of these codes here, so just make certain you're not reporting with secondary syphilis or late syphilis or neurogenetic syphilis or diabetes mellitus, diabetes conditions that are caused by other specified codes. That just means any 0.69 ending for your diabetes code. Just don't use that with these conditions. Vaginal signs and symptoms. Here we're in our N sections here. Very popular codes we have are the N77.1, the vaginitis vulvitis, and, well, you know these codes. This whole section here's the fun section. Once again, it's the same thing that we're going to keep seeing here over and over again. It all boils down to the coding guidelines of you always have to code to the highest level of specificity, and sign and symptom codes aren't as good as actual definitive codes. So, of course, vaginitis and vulvitis are going to be excluded by all of these actual A and B codes for vaginal conditions because these are confirmed infections. So, of course, there's going to be itching. That's just what's going to happen when you have these infections. So just make certain as a coder that you're aware, since this is more your job than the provider's job, is the provider's going to order UTIs, well, not as much UTIs, vaginal panels or stuff like that, using these codes here. It is your responsibility as a coder to delete these codes and leave it with the more confirmed condition if it does turn out that the patient does have candidus or something like that. It's the same thing for the N90 codes. This is where you're going to find your vaginal discharge codes and such like that, very commonly used codes. Once again, it's going to be excluded by actually definitive conditions that are going to cause this. Missed abortion codes 02.1. Just want to point out very quickly that this code is only valid for the first 20 weeks. Use different codes if you are past that. And it is only usable when there's retention of the dead fetus. You do see that quite frequently, where people will use it instead for it. It has a lot of different exclusions here, where it's going to be excluded by other missed abortion codes, because that's why you have to use the most appropriate one. The big note that I want to point out that I think a lot of providers get wrong with these codes, though, is you would only use this code when there's actually retention of the dead fetus. If you are doing follow-up care for a miscarriage, you're actually usually better off just using a Z09 code instead for the follow-up care than using one of these O codes, because a lot of these O2 codes can make it end up being that you're going to get a denial from insurance saying, where's the consent form? Because if you have like 02.9, the unspecified abortion code, that one actually implies complete without complications. So a lot of insurance are going to assume that you did the abortion yourself. So only use this 02.1 code when there actually is retention. It's the only time you want to use it. And if there's retention, and if you're the one like prescribing emergency contraceptive or something like that, then you can attach the emergency contraceptive code, and then it's going to be absolutely appropriate to use this code. Otherwise, if you're just strictly doing a follow-up for a miscarriage or something like that, I would recommend just using a Z09 instead for follow-up care. RO6, abnormalities of breathing. Jesus, now that's a word that I should just know. I do know it, but that just shows how tizzied I get when I start doing presentations. It's very fun. I do love it. And I want to keep on doing it, though. So, let's look at RO6 here. Abnormalities of breathing. These codes have their own little guidelines here that are going to be not capable to work with other codes. Once again, though, this is going to be like the hyperlipidemia section, though, that I'm going to keep boiling back to, where it's going to seem like wheezing only has one exclusion, and that being asthma. That's actually not the case. Wheezing includes also all of these codes here. As you can see, most of them are just newborn codes. That's what the P code is. So that just lets you know if it's anything with a newborn having a breathing condition, don't use wheezing. Instead, use the actual breathing condition. And then respiratory failure and acute respiratory distress is also going to exclude it. Then there's like hyperventilation. That's going to exclude all of these. Obviously, if you have respiratory arrest, you're going to have hyperventilation. And that's also going to exclude psychogenetic hyperventilation. So just watch out for these codes here. Just make certain you're using them properly. Just don't use RO6.2 as wheezing with asthma. That's the main one that you see people do often. Nausea and vomiting. Nausea and vomiting is kind of an interesting code that a lot of people don't realize. This is how it's broken down. So I just want to show this more than the exclusions, actually. Is how it's broken down is R11.0 is actually nausea without vomiting. R11.10 is vomiting unspecified. So a lot of times providers will report R11.0 with R11.10, and that's actually inappropriate, and that's going to cause denials. Because what you're saying is they have nausea without vomiting, but they also have vomiting. Instead, you have to use R11.2, which is nausea with vomiting. So just make sure you're aware of that with these codes. That's how it's broken down. It's really stupid and silly, quite frankly. I just think it's something that they're able to deny us for, so just watch out for that. So if someone has nausea and vomiting, make certain to use R11.2. Nausea on its own implies that there's no vomiting, and vomiting on its own implies there's no nausea. Isn't it kind of funny how it works that way? Abnormal movements in gait. These gaits have, these codes have their own little guidelines here, where a lot of the times it's going to be mostly neurological conditions and such that they're not able to work with. So if there's an actual neurological condition code, that's what these G20s through G26 codes are, don't use these codes. Instead, use the actually more specific code, obviously. And then difficulty in walking, not elsewhere classified, that's going to be excluded by falling code. This is the recent falling code, so just make certain you use one or the other depending on the circumstance of what's going on. And then tremors unspecified is going to obviously exclude more, obviously, actual tremor codes. So just keep going back to that. Always remember that. R codes are sign and symptom codes is what they're known as. These are all sign and symptom codes, R codes. So that means anytime you have an R code with an actual diagnosis, it's going to be denied if they're linked together, generally speaking, because obviously they're going to be expected. Fever here is a good example for that, kind of perfect. That fever is going to be excluded by conditions that are expected to have fevers. And then drug-induced fever, R50.2. I like to point out this one because a lot of people miss this guideline, where you also have to report the drug that's causing the fever. No one really expects providers to get these codes right, but make certain you explicitly tell your coding team in your documentation what drug caused it, so then coding can attach the proper T code. If you can attach the T code as a provider, I will love you forever, even though I already love you forever. Fever presenting with conditions classified elsewhere, R50.81. This one also has code first guidelines, and then these guidelines are with all R50 codes, by the way. So it's, once again, the post-fever one. It's not just these 3 exclusions. It's also these 7 on this side here. So just always remember that. Don't just look under the single code itself. Always look back up in the book at the start of the code and the start of each coding section to make certain there's not hidden excludeds, as I like to call them. Pain unspecified. This one has the longest list of exclusions I think we've seen so far, because obviously it's really not that great of a code. I generally delete it 99% of the time that I see it. I more like it as providers using it as a crutch code for more or less just quickly doing charting and writing down their information. And then it's my role as a coder to actually make this into usable information for the other billers and stuff like that. So just quite simply, R52 is just a basic pain code. So obviously it's going to exclude any actual pain code. Any localized actual pain is going to exclude it. It's just really kind of a nonsense code that's not that great. So that's why I think it's a fantastic crutch code. I always recommend to my providers crutch codes, as I call them. Just quickly select, quickly chart on it, because any coder worth a grain of salt is instantly going to see this code and be like, oh, that's a really bad code. I should probably change it to something more specific. So personally, I like crutch codes. I advise my providers to use them. I would recommend advising your providers to use them too at times, because sometimes they just have to chart quickly. And when a patient's coming in and they have 6 different sites of pain, I really would not expect them to list all 6 localized sites of pain. I will, because I have to, and that is coding guidelines. But me, I more expect the providers to just document. Document, document, document. And then I think this is our last R code until, yeah, it looks like it is. All we have left are the fainting and shock codes. Fainting and shock obviously have their own bunch of exclusions too. And once again, as you can see, for shock, it's pretty much all definitive shocks. If you have a more specific shock code, use those specific shock codes. Well, sinoscopy is actually excluded by shock itself and a bunch of other shock codes here, as you can see. And then it's excluded by more specific sinoscopy codes as well. So just be careful with these 2 codes. Just be certain you have the right R57 code with R55. If you use an unspecified shock with collapse, it will be denied. Generally speaking, usually the R55 or the R57 isn't that good anyways. The R57 is usually more important. But hey, make certain to read the chart and figure out whether or not there is a R55 code that could potentially go with it. More than likely not. And finally, we're going to move on to CKD and hypertension here just to wrap it up on the medical side of things. Yep, looks like that's it. And these ones are just not as much exclusions, but just a quick code also and code first note since I got you here and we're talking about it. CKD, how this one works, it has its own code first any association, where how coding guidelines work is CKD will always have an assumed nature with hypertension and diabetes. Because obviously it will both affect the body in very drastic ways and the whole function. So unless you as a provider are explicitly stating that the CKD or hypertension are not related to each other, or the CKD and diabetes aren't related together, it will always be assumed that they are linked together. So just note that these codes exist. So if I have a type 2 diabetic who has CKD, he will have to have this E11.22 code. Then let's say he has CKD stage 3A, that would make it N18.31, I believe is the ICD-10 code for it. That's what you would have to have on it. So just make certain you're aware of code first as well as excluded diagnoses. Code first and code alsos are very important because it's just another reason why insurance can deny us. And make certain you give insurance no reason to ever deny you. Next is hypertension here. Hypertension has its own little excluded here where it excludes other conditions. Main one I want to point out is, since hypertension is such a big guidelines for everyone these days, is tobacco are required additional codes for every single hypertension code. So make certain you use those. I1A.0 is a newer, very popular code resistant hypertension, but just note that this is actually a status code. You also have to code the specific existing hypertension as long as it's known. So just make certain you're doing that whenever you have resistant hypertension. And then this hypertension code, as you can see, works kind of the same way how CKD works, where it boils down into its own categories with assumed natures as well. Hypertension has assumed nature with CKD, and it has assumed nature with hypertensive heart disease or chronic heart failure, anything like that. So if a patient has both chronic heart failure and chronic kidney disease and hypertension, your coding team will actually have to update your code to I13 every single time, so that way the patient doesn't get denied. If you use the generic I10 essential primary hypertension code with one of these linked conditions, insurance does have the right to deny us every time. And what do we say when insurance has the right? They will do it. Psychoactive substance use disorders and abuse. This is an interesting guideline that I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of when it comes to the drug condition codes. This would be what, F10 through F18 section. When it comes to the drug codes, how it works is these are actually statuses of it, where it ends with use, I believe, is 0.9, dependency is 0.2, and abuse is 0.8, I believe. That's the root ending of each, well, not the root beginning, the fourth character for each of the drug codes. So how these guidelines work is a patient can have only one of these statuses at a time. So let's say I have a patient record come over and the provider says that the patient has opioid use, opioid abuse, and opioid dependency. I'll have to review the chart and really make certain which one the provider is truly saying the patient has, and then code only one of them. This here is the tiering of how each condition works, and each one you will use depending on the notage. More or less how the hierarchy works is use is the lowest, then it goes abuse, then it goes dependence. When you have all three on one record, you will only use dependence every single time, since that's the highest level code. So just make certain you're aware of this when it comes to drug coding. Now, it doesn't mean that a patient can't have more than one drug in general, it's just they can't have more than one status. So what that means is someone could have alcohol dependency on theirs, they could have an opioid abuse code, F11.9, and then the cannabis use code, F13.8, I believe it'd be. So that's how it would work. But you can only have one status for each drug type. Just make certain you're aware of that. Quick note on that one too is the F19 code is known as other substance use or polysubstance use. Note that polysubstance use is only used for when you're not certain which drug is causing all their different issues. If a patient has like multiple, let's say they're addicted to cocaine, marijuana, opiates, alcohol, all 4 of those codes would be separately reported is the actual proper way of doing things, instead of doing one single F19. And bonus for all of us, a lot of those are HCC codes. So hey, it's beneficial for everyone to report actually each individual drug code because it really shows the level of care that you're providing. Next mental health code here, we have the bipolar disorder codes. Bipolar codes exclude every single one of the depression codes here. So you can't have bipolar disorder reported with any F30, F32, or F33 codes. Because obviously depression is going to be expected in bipolar. So instead, what you're supposed to do if you have someone with a bipolar and depressive episodes is you're supposed to use these bipolar depression codes. We have bipolar depression codes to be used actually. So it would be inappropriate actually to report F31.9 bipolar disorder unspecified with an F32. It's more or less lazy charting and lazy diagnosing. Instead, as a provider, you're supposed to be giving us the most specific bipolar depressive episode codes possible, because coders aren't going to be able to guess that. Instead, we're just going to have to chop off one of these 3 codes and probably leave it unspecified. So make certain you as a provider are coding your bipolar patients to the highest level of specificity possible. We don't want to be using unspecified bipolar all the time. The schizophrenia and schizoaffective codes, those ones obviously exclude each other. You can't have schizophrenia and schizoaffective at the same time. It's either one or the other. And then these are going to exclude a bunch of depression codes as well. Any of the depression disorder codes that have psychotic symptoms with them, those are the 0.3 endings and such for the F33s and the F32s.3s. Just make certain you chop off those codes because they can't be together. And this is set up that way because the schizophrenia also has more specific codes, where you shouldn't be using the depression. Instead, maybe schizoaffective depressive type is the more proper code to use for your patient than instead having schizophrenia with a depression code. So once again, just like bipolar, your coders aren't going to be able to diagnose your patients, so things are probably going to stay at these unspecified areas. But they will have to chop off these depression codes to make certain no denials are happening. So make certain you as the provider are always coding the schizophrenia, bipolar, all those conditions to the highest level possible. MO6.7, mild neurocognitive disorder due to known psychological condition. This one has a lot of exclusions. Actually, this is the code first, sorry, the exclusions I have on the right side here. The code first for this is obviously you have to code first the condition that's causing it, whether or not it's Alzheimer's or HIV/AIDS or something like that that is actually causing their neurocognitive disorder. And then it excludes a lot of these other codes here for more or less conditions that are expected to cause this disorder. It's kind of confusing to me because I'm not MedBrain, but I just have to memorize this as a coder, that I can't use these with dementia. So just remember that. I just kind of have to memorize that one myself. So just keep an eye out for these codes here and make certain you're reporting them properly, and make certain you're always coding first the underlying physiological condition that caused it. Thinking there for a second, I wonder if that was why dementia's on here, because it's not a physiological condition. The more I think about it, I do think it is, so sorry, that's kind of why I just paused there and thought for a moment, and then I thought that's not worth sharing, and then I decided maybe it is worth sharing. So hey, drop a comment at the bottom if you're a doctor and you can explain to me why dementia isn't appropriate for these, but all these conditions are. Just really genuinely curious. Other mental health exclusions to watch out for is, as we've learned, depression excludes bipolar. It excludes other depression codes too. It's either episodic depression or recurrent depression. It can't be both, so make certain you're attaching the right one. Anxiety just has excluded too, so don't have to worry about that. Manic episodes is obviously going to exclude bipolar, so if you have both on a chart, it's going to be up to your coding team to more or less review your records, figure out which one is actually more pertinent to that situation, and then use that code. Agoraphobia is obviously going to be excluded by panic disorder, because of course there's going to be panics with it, so just make sure you keep an eye on these. The F codes are kind of the biggest section when it comes to exclusions, so personally, I always open up my book on a lot of F codes, usually at the start of each quarter, just to make certain I'm refreshing myself on all the excludeds. Like schizophrenia is very big in my population, so I have a lot of these memorized, but still, it's always important to look at it every few days. And that is it for excluded diagnoses. So now that you've known a little bit more about these, just make certain you're always reporting things to the highest level of specificity. More or less what a lot of these broken down to, as we've seen, is just the conditions are more specific. It's one condition's more specific than the other, so obviously they can't be together. And truly, the excluded list isn't even all-inclusive, because something like fever is going to exclude quite a few more things, because there's the whole guidelines of signs and symptoms with definitive diagnosis. So for example, if someone ends up being diagnosed with COVID, obviously they're going to have a fever, so it's silly to have R50 code on it. So the exclusion list is actually even longer than some of these, but this is just the most important ones that are important to consider, but also always consider that caveat when we're dealing with R codes. Remember, they're known as sign and symptom codes, so if it ever is a sign or symptom of a more definitive diagnosis, insurance probably still might deny you for it, even if it's not just on this list, because they may decide that it's included. Because frankly, they probably are right that a cough should be included in COVID, for example. But that's excluded diagnoses. I hope you had some fun with this video. I sure did. It was a fun one to write. Sorry I butchered so many words, but honestly, I think that's kind of the fun thing, and I'm hoping that'll be the charm of my videos. I'm a wacky guy. Have fun with me, and I'll have fun with you guys. Have a great day. Thanks, and bye.